The Abbott farmhouse sat in a hollow of bare trees, their branches twisted against a sky drained of color. It was the spring of 1861, and in Michigan the talk of war had already reached every road, every porch, every prayer meeting. The Abbott family had 6 sons, each strong and eager, and the town whispered their name with pride, calling them a line of men soon to march together. Yet inside the Abbott home, as the candle flames wavered in the drafty halls, there was no sound of celebration, no clinking of cups or prayers of farewell. There was only the heavy silence of a house holding its breath, as though some secret pressed against the walls, begging not to be spoken aloud. Elias Abbott, the father, sat at the table with his Bible resting open but unread. His hand lingered on the pages too long, as though he were stroking skin instead of paper. His eyes carried a shine that others mistook for faith, but which his children knew as something harder, colder, a look that weighed and measured rather than comforted. To neighbors, Elias was known as steady, a man who never raised his voice, who bowed his head at the right times and gave thanks even when harvests were thin. But beneath his measured smile was a patience that frightened even his wife in the quiet of night. She never spoke of it, not once, for she too knew that silence in this house was safer than truth. The sons gathered near the hearth, their boots polished, coats folded, weapons prepared. Their bodies were restless, their voices low, and their eyes often turned to their father as if seeking permission to feel. Elias never told them he was proud. Instead, he reminded them that the world beyond these walls was chaos, a machine that would grind them down. He told them their only chance to outlast war was obedience. His words carried no warmth, only weight, and though the boys laughed together in small bursts, it faded quickly into that thick silence that always returned. The night deepened, and outside the wind dragged through the barns, rattling the beams as if something unseen walked there. Elias, his wife, lit another candle, though the room needed no more light. She looked at her husband, waiting for him to tell the boys to rest, but his face betrayed nothing. Instead, he studied them with the care of a man who measured cattle before slaughter, his gaze moving from shoulder to shoulder, jaw to jaw, as though each son were not flesh of his own flesh, but material, clay waiting to be reshaped. He saw not 6 boys stepping into manhood, but 6 bodies to be arranged, 6 vessels to be tested against forces greater than any war. It was in moments like this that Elias felt the swelling in his chest that others would mistake for love. He believed he was chosen to preserve what war would soon consume. For him, the nation's tearing apart was no tragedy but an opening, a veil lifting to reveal the truth he had always carried alone. The sons were his offering, his instruments, and in their silence he could already sense their surrender. Each one looked to him not with trust, but with the kind of fear that roots itself deep in a child and never leaves. That fear was his true inheritance to them. The farmhouse itself seemed complicit in this ritual of unspoken dread. The wooden floors groaned as though carrying the memory of every step Elias had taken through the years. The smell of oil and smoke clung to the walls, and beneath the boards the earth carried the weight of hidden things, buried animals, broken tools, and other remnants Elias had discarded when they no longer served his work. The sons never asked why certain doors remained locked, why the barn cellar was forbidden after dark, why their father always carried a ring of keys that jingled faintly even when he moved without sound. They knew only that questions led to silence, and silence in this house was law. As midnight approached, the candles burned lower, and the mother guided the younger sons to their rooms. The older boys lingered, sharpening blades with a slow rhythm that filled the room like a funeral drum. Elias watched them, his eyes half closed as though savoring the sound. For him, every scrape of steel was not preparation for war, but preparation for something more intimate, more enduring. He imagined the weight of those blades in his hands, how their edges could divide more than flesh, how they could become tools of revelation. His mind did not dwell on battlefields or soldiers, it dwelled on chambers without windows, on rituals where sound was forbidden, on the transformation of sons into silent proof of his order. When at last the house settled into uneasy sleep, Elias remained awake. He rose from the table, gathered the keys at his belt, and moved with the quiet certainty of a man fulfilling a purpose long rehearsed. He walked past each closed door, pausing only once to listen to the soft breath of the boys who would not live to see the dawn. His hand hovered over the latch, but he did not enter. There was no need yet. The work of tomorrow was already decided, already sealed in his mind. Outside, the world was preparing for war. Drums would soon beat, flags would rise, and families would weep as sons marched away. But in this farmhouse, on this night, war was not the greatest horror. What stirred behind Elias Abbott's smile, what pulsed in his silent steps through the hallway, was something colder than war itself. It was the calm conviction of a man who believed that sacrifice did not belong to nations but to fathers, and that his sons were not leaving him for battle. They were already his to claim. And so the eve of war ended not with prayer or farewell, but with silence, heavy and suffocating, wrapping the Abbott home like a shroud, preparing it for the darkness to come. When the first thin light of dawn touched the Abbott farm, the beds of the 6 sons lay cold and empty. Their blankets were smoothed flat as though no bodies had ever rested. There, their boots neatly aligned by the door, their personal belongings undisturbed. The mother claimed she had risen in the early hours to see them off, but her voice trembled when she said it, and she avoided the eyes of anyone who asked. She spoke of hurried farewells, of brave words whispered in the dark, yet none of the neighbors recalled the sound of wagon wheels leaving, nor the crack of boots on frost. It was as if the 6 boys had been plucked from the earth, leaving no trace of their passage. Word spread quickly. Some said the Abbott sons had risen before the roosters crow to march toward the depot, eager to be the first enlisted. Others muttered that Elias Abbott had kept the departure secret, guarding his son's honor from curious eyes. Yet when men searched the dirt road that led away from the farm, they found no wheel ruts, no scuffed tracks, not even the imprint of a horse's hoof. The soil was smooth, unbroken, as though it had lain untouched for days. For those who paused too long on that road, unease crept in. For war might explain absence, but it could not explain silence left so perfect. The Abbott farmhouse carried on as though nothing was wrong. Elias greeted neighbors with his steady smile, telling them his boys had gone to do God's work. He bowed his head in church and listened to the names of the county's sons being read aloud with solemn pride. Yet behind his expression was a calmness too polished, too rehearsed. the calmness of a man who had already sealed away the truth and found comfort in its permanence. Those who spoke with him described a man not grieving but glowing faintly, as if loss had sharpened him rather than broken him. His wife stood beside him, pale and hollow-eyed, her hands twisting in her apron as if they had forgotten what stillness meant. Days passed, and still no letters arrived from the sons. The regiment had no record of 6 brothers from the Abbott farm. Commanders shook their heads and said perhaps they had enlisted under another county. Perhaps their names had been misspelled. Perhaps their papers had been lost in the rush of war. But doubt crept in when messengers came back with reports from enlistment stations. No Abbott boys were found in any line. No signatures marked their names. It was as if they had not only vanished from their home, but from the nation itself. The neighbors began to whisper, though none dared speak too loud. They said the Abbotts' fields had grown strange, that the earth smelled of iron and oil even after rain, that stray dogs refused to walk the property's edge. One boy claimed he had seen Elias at dusk digging in the orchard, his lantern glowing while the shape of something long and heavy dragged beside him. No one believed the boy, yet no one went to see for themselves. Fear makes cowards of neighbors, and fear of Elias was thicker than pity for his missing sons. Beneath the soil of the Abbott homestead, where no plow would ever strike, the first signs of truth waited. Buried shallow in the orchard was a tangle of charred rope, its fibers fused with wax, as though it had been used not to bind livestock but to hold something human against flame. In the ash pit behind the barn, someone found a shard of bone blackened at its tip, small enough to be mistaken for a deer's, though no deer had ever been buried so deep or so carefully. These discoveries were whispered about and then buried again in silence, for to accuse Elias Abbott was to accuse a man who spoke with God's authority, and in times of war authority was a shield none dared pierce. Elias himself moved through these days with a strange serenity. He tended his fields with precision, his rows of crops straight as military lines. He walked the property at night, lantern in hand, the glow revealing the faintest outlines of shallow depressions in the earth that were never there in the morning. When questioned, he spoke of mole tunnels, of badgers digging, of nothing worth worrying about. Yet those who glimpsed the ground at dawn swore the soil seemed disturbed in shapes too long, too narrow, too deliberate for animals. They began to believe that the land itself was swallowing the Abbott sons, and Elias was only its keeper. In his home, the silence grew unbearable. His wife's voice faded to little more than whispers, her eyes refusing to meet the windows after dark. At night she claimed she heard the floorboards creak, though no one walked them, heard faint breath pressed against the walls, though the rooms were empty. Once she confided in a neighbor that the smell of candle wax followed her into her dreams, dripping and heavy, clinging to her skin like a second flesh. That neighbor told no one, for what words could explain such horror without marking oneself as mad? The community busy with war allowed the mystery to fade into silence. Men left for battlefields, women tended homes, and the Abbott disappearance became one more sorrow swallowed by the greater grief of a nation. But on that farm, where soil was always darker, where candles burned longer than they should, where a father walked with a lantern long after midnight, the truth remained. 6 sons had not left for war. They had been claimed by something colder than war, something that grew not from the chaos of the world, but from the methodical hunger of a single man's mind. And as weeks turned to months, whispers turned into warnings. Travelers avoided the road past the Abbott land, and children dared each other to touch the gate only to flee at the first sound of wind in the trees. The name Abbott no longer stirred pride but dread, and beneath the ground where wax met bone and silence was stitched into the earth, the first ritual traces of Elias's true nature began to surface, waiting for the storm that would one day drag them into the light. Elias Abbott was known in the township as a man of unshakable faith. He carried himself with the calm authority of one who believed the Bible was carved not just in stone but in the marrow of his own bones. He attended services without fail, sat in the front pew with his head bowed, and spoke with measured gentleness when others quarreled. To the grieving, he offered scripture. To the poor, he gave cornmeal or firewood, and to the minister, he pledged his loyalty as a humble servant of God. Neighbors said Elias was steady, unmovable, a man who bore hardship without complaint. But behind that piety, behind the firm clasp of his hands and the quiet gleam of his smile, he kept another book that no one in the congregation had ever seen. It was small enough to fit into a pocket, bound in cracked leather, stained with oil and dirt from years of handling. In the front half, it contained nothing suspicious: entries of seed purchased, debts collected, livestock counted. To any who glanced through it, the ledger would appear ordinary, the work of a farmer intent on keeping order in his affairs. But in the back, where the pages had been trimmed with careful fingers and stitched tighter into the spine, Elias had written his true account. Here he copied words from Scripture but rearranged them into patterns that no preacher would recognize, shapes of letters curling into strange diagrams, verses broken apart and rejoined with numbers, measurements, and times of day. What looked at first like devotion was, upon closer inspection, the scaffolding of experiments. Elias saw his ledger not as a record but as revelation. He wrote of blood as if it were soil, of flesh as if it were timber, of breath as if it were currency that could be counted and saved. He measured the heart not in beats of love but in how long it could endure strain before faltering. To him, the body was a farm waiting to be cultivated, each son a field where a different harvest might grow. He recorded their strengths and weaknesses not as a father praising or correcting, but as a farmer noting weather and yield. One son's lungs carried more volume, another's bones bent more before they cracked, another's mind held longer against silence before breaking. Each line of his ledger was a cold devotion, proof that Elias believed his work was not cruelty but duty. What he called experiments were never done in haste. Elias prepared them with the same patience he used in tilling land, waiting for the soil to soften before planting. In the hidden pages he outlined rituals timed to moon phases, seasons, even the passing of storms, believing the heavens themselves lent strength to his trials. He did not call them deaths. He called them offerings. He convinced himself that his sons had not vanished into nothingness but had crossed into preservation through his hands. For Elias, immortality was not eternal life in heaven but the stopping of decay on earth, the fixing of a soul in a moment so it could never be touched by time. When the neighbors asked after his boys, Elias spoke with calm certainty that they were in God's service. He allowed them to believe he meant the army, but his words carried another meaning. For him, service meant submission to his work, surrender to the ritual silence he demanded. He hid this truth easily because his demeanor never cracked. He smiled, shook hands, prayed with conviction, and never once let grief stain his voice. His absence of mourning was accepted as strength, when in truth it was evidence of obsession. The ledger itself, were it ever found, would chill even the most hardened soldier. Between its pages lay drawings of tools altered into grotesque devices, each sketched with the precision of a craftsman. A plowshare filed into a blade designed not to till earth but to peel layers of flesh with steady pressure. A grain press reconfigured into a vise that could compress bone until marrow seeped. Lanterns converted to drip wax with measured rhythm, not to light paths but to test endurance. Every invention bore not just function but ritual tied to numbers, to verses, to cycles Elias believed granted power. And yet, despite the horror his words revealed, Elias remained invisible in plain sight. The very traits that should have betrayed him, his calm, his orderliness, his unwavering certainty, were the ones that made him appear trustworthy. In a time when chaos swept across the nation, when families lost sons by the thousands to war, Elias stood as an anchor. Neighbors envied his composure. Widows leaned on his prayers. The minister praised him as a pillar of godliness. Not a soul suspected that the very qualities they admired were the masks of a man who had already buried his 6 sons in a darkness deeper than any battlefield could claim. To Elias, his disguise was not even a lie. He believed himself chosen, set apart by a higher calling. He saw no contradiction between the hymns he sang on Sunday and the rituals he performed in the silence of his barn. Both were worshipped in his eyes. Both were his attempt to touch eternity. And if others could not see it, that only proved their blindness. His piety was not a mask he wore reluctantly. It was the outer layer of a belief system so twisted it circled back upon itself, appearing whole to those who only glanced at the surface. Thus the man known as humble Elias Abbott, faithful farmer and father, walked among his neighbors carrying the secret weight of 6 vanished sons. He tilled his fields, offered prayers, and gave blessings while his ledger grew thick with diagrams and numbers that mapped not life but the anatomy of death. What the world thought war had claimed, Elias had already consumed. And in the silence of his private book, he convinced himself he had conquered time itself, a man of God reshaping flesh into his vision of forever. Beneath the Abbott barn, where the smell of hay should have been thick and the air should have been warm with livestock, there was another place, one no neighbor would ever see. The trap door was built into the farthest corner beneath a mound of tools that no one thought to move, its edges hidden by years of dust. When lifted, it revealed a ladder that led into blackness, down into soil that had been carved and reinforced with timbers to form a space larger than any cellar had right to be. The chamber below was not meant for storage. It was built for endurance, for silence, for ritual. The walls were damp with stains that never dried, marked by the water that seeped through earth and ran down into grooves Elias had cut deliberately, as though channeling not just water but something unseen. Iron hooks jutted from beams at measured intervals, polished by use, though no livestock had ever been tethered there. The floor bore dark rings of old oil and wax hardened into stone-like ridges. Evidence of lanterns burned longer than they were meant to last. It was a place stripped of comfort, built with the patience of a man who believed perfection required control. Here Elias rehearsed what he called his rituals of perfection. His sons were led into this place not as children or soldiers, but as subjects. Elias viewed each one as a vessel to test the boundary between flesh and eternity. Each body a canvas upon which he could carve proof of his twisted faith. He did not rage, did not punish in sudden bursts. Instead, his methods were slow, deliberate, arranged like prayers repeated again and again until their meaning shifted into something unrecognizable. One son was bound to a harness frame, the same kind once used for breaking horses. Elias had altered it with iron bars and screws, turning it into an engine of pressure. He tightened the straps slowly, each crank bending the boy's spine degree by degree until breath came in gasps and bones creaked like old timber in the wind. He recorded how many turns the body could withstand, how long the heart kept beating after the breaking point, and he noted the silence that followed, as if silence itself was the true measure of success. For Elias, it was not cruelty but revelation, the proof that human form could be remade with the same tools that once tamed beasts. Another son was taken to a trough filled not with water but with soil dampened into heavy mud. Elias held his head beneath its surface, not forcing the body with violence, but lowering it with the patience of a farmer planting seed. The lungs filled not with liquid but with earth, grain by grain, pressing into every space where air should have been. Elias believed that water was too quick, too forgiving, while soil was eternal, the very matter from which man was shaped. To drown in soil was to be returned to origin, and he studied the shudders of his son's body as though they were scriptures, lines of a sacred text only he could read. A third was chosen for a different ritual, one Elias had refined over long nights of thought. He cut shallow lines across the skin, guiding the blood into bowls, not draining to kill, but measuring with precision how much could be taken before life began to waver. When the blood ran too thin, he replaced it with melted candle wax, pouring it carefully into wounds, watching it harden as if sealing the body into permanence. For him, this was not mutilation but preservation, an attempt to arrest decay by turning living tissue into something between flesh and artifact. He believed the soul lingered in wax, that the flicker of a candle flame was not just light but essence made visible. Each act was carried out with calm devotion. Elias spoke softly as he worked, his words laced with fragments of psalms and numbers from his ledger. His hands moved with the steadiness of a craftsman, never trembling, never rushing. The chamber became an altar, and his sons became offerings, their cries swallowed by thick soil walls until they dissolved into silence. For Elias, silence was the goal. Silence was proof that resistance had ended, that the body had crossed into the state he sought. It was never about pain for its own sake. Pain was only the path. Silence was perfection. The chamber below absorbed everything. The hooks held weight that left permanent grooves in their iron. The wood darkened with stains that no cleansing could erase. The air thickened with the scent of smoke, wax, and decay until it seemed to cling even to Elias when he emerged into daylight. Yet no one in the world above knew. To them, Elias remained the same, a man of God, a steady neighbor, a farmer who worked long hours and never raised his voice, The evil he performed below their feet was hidden not by distance but by the mask of his ordinary life. In the end, each son was taken into that chamber and made part of its silence. Their bodies were never carried out whole, but broken down, preserved, or concealed in ways that erased their presence from the world. Elias believed he had not lost his sons, but kept them closer than any father ever had, transformed into proof of his power over time and flesh. The chamber became both grave and monument, a place where fatherhood was rewritten as ownership, where love was twisted into method. And above, the barn stood unchanged, horses stamped in stalls, hay lay piled in lofts, and neighbors passed by without suspicion. No sound rose from beneath the floor, for Elias had designed it that way. The chamber below was a world sealed off, a hidden heart of the farm where the true nature of Elias Abbott pulsed, steady as the ticking of a clock. It was the place where method and madness became indistinguishable, where the face of godliness was unmasked to reveal the slow, patient work of a man who believed immortality could be built out of silence and pain. The coffin was not built for burial but for counting, and Elias measured its boards like a surveyor, marked inches where other fathers marked height, lined the inside with oilcloth to hold breath, threaded glass tubes from the mouth to stopcocks and jars, sealing seams with beeswax until it shone. He guided his fourth son to the box with the patience of a pastor leading someone to a pew, steady hand on the shoulder, voice level, offering reassurance without comfort while his eyes weighed the body the way a miller weighs grain, cool, exact, already planning the totals. When the lid closed, the room tightened and the candles burned flatter, and Elias watched the tubes quiver as the first exhale traveled down. A thin silver ribbon pooling in glass like a captured ghost, ready for numbers, ready for proof that fear could be tamed into silence. He kept a rack of jars marked with tide lines, wrote down each breath taken and each breath lost, timed the stopcocks with a metronome in his head, counting panic as if it were currency used to purchase stillness. Inside the box, the boy's struggle rose and fell, but the oilcloth held and the valves whispered, and Elias recorded the instant when the chest stopped fighting the cadence and became an obedient bellows. Noting the exact minute when the will thinned and the ritual finally took over. He believed breath was prayer in motion, and that by catching each exhale he could weigh the soul's leaving, mapping steps between sound and hush, distance and return, record and erasure, until only the blank remained. The page he worshipped, the white space he called perfection. To slow resistance he patted the lid with folded cloth, not to comfort but to mute the sounds that offended the right, resting his palm on the wood until the trembling eased. The way a farmer quiets a skittish horse before harnessing it to a new, unkind design. Every few minutes he opened one valve and closed another, sliding measurements like beads on a rosary. And he wrote that breath thins when fear is admitted, steadies when hope dims, and that silence arrives like weather, gradual and everywhere impossible to refuse. When the jars stopped fogging, he drew a neat line across the page and called the duration perfect. Not long enough to invite chaos, not short enough to seem careless, lifted the lid as if finishing a hymn, and accepted the hush as confirmation that order had won. He cleaned the tubes with vinegar and heat, polished the glass, wiped the box with lye, sealed the coffin as if storing a tool, content that a fresh corner of quiet had been nailed to the world. a measured square where his will and time agreed to stop moving. His fifth son met a grain silo prepared with the same odd care, seams caulked, chute scrubbed, winch oiled, because Elias believed wheat was the cleanest earth, cut small enough to pour like time, unjudging and endless, blind to names, blind to please, faithful only to wait. He led the boy inside at dusk, bound his arms to the center post with leather straps softened in tallow, told him to breathe evenly, then raised the gate and listened as kernels fell like rain. A soft river around the shins, then the thighs, then the waist, creeping higher with patience. Elias watched the chest work against pressure that never struck and yet never paused, a merciless embrace that would not bruise. And he wrote that wheat tests faith without spectacle because each grain demands a decision and the body keeps deciding wrong, teaching ribs the shape of surrender. When grain covered the mouth, he slid a short tube between the lips and pinned it to the post. Not to save him, but to lengthen the measure, and he counted the clogging seconds with his thumb against wood as if tallying seed, as if harvest could be taken from breath itself. He listened for the moment when movement became noise and noise became nothing, held his attention like a valve, refusing to blink while thunder walked near, until the silo learned its own slow breathing and the wheat cooled like night water around stone, indifferent, complete, exact. He stopped the chute, wrote the final interval, shoveled enough grain to find the face, pressed the eyelids closed with two careful fingers, tied a cloth around the jaw as farmers do for animals they respect, making cruelty look like practice, making practice look like prayer. Upstairs he washed his hands with lye until the skin cracked, rubbed beeswax into the splits, opened the ledger and wrote that silence has levels like a stair. First the room's hush, then the inner hush, then the last hush where even memory forgets its shape and never returns. He wrote that breath is not the gate between life and death. Attention is, and when attention breaks and does not return, a person is finished regardless of heartbeat. And he shaded small squares to mark where suns had crossed over. Squares neat as fields seen from far above. He closed the book and stepped outside where the night smelled of wheat dust, oil and faint iron, and the silo resumed its inward shifting like a grave, rearranging itself after the mourners left, the farm seeming closer to eternity, calmer, heavier, more obedient to his rules. Neighbors would say the sons left early for war, and he let them say it. For war was a neat story, and neat stories make safe fences, while he tightened each proof, visited the coffin at dawn, the silo at dusk, and learned how hoarded silence leaks into wind before a storm. The town carried on with the weight of war pressing against every street and prayer meeting. Young men disappeared from farms and villages each week, marching toward camps where their names were recorded in ledgers no one back home would ever see. Mothers wept at the sight of empty chairs, fathers shook hands with grim pride, and ministers preached of sacrifice. In such a season of loss, no absence was questioned too deeply, and the 6 vanished Abbott sons became part of that chorus of grief. To speak of them was to nod solemnly, to sigh, to say that Elias Abbott had given more than most, and to let the matter rest. Elias leaned into this role with precision. He sat in the front pew each Sunday, not merely as a farmer, but as a figure of example. When his turn came to pray aloud, he spoke of surrendering sons to the cause of freedom, of carrying private sorrow in the name of public duty. His voice never wavered. His eyes glistened at the right moment, and his head bowed low enough to cast a shadow of humility across his neighbors. Those who listened felt steadied by him, as though his loss confirmed their own courage. What none realized was that Elias's words were never about war, but about his rituals. A coded sermon where sacrifice meant obedience to him, and loss meant perfection gained through silence. The fields on the Abbott farm grew steadily that summer, rows of corn and barley rising in even lines, stalks that seemed stronger than the soil should have allowed. Neighbors praised Elias for his diligence, saying God had rewarded his faith with fertile ground. They did not see the fragments beneath, splinters of bone mixed into furrows, wax that clung to roots like hardened dew, soil that carried a faint iron tang long after rain. Elias walked those fields with pride, not as a farmer seeing harvest, but as a keeper walking a cemetery he had planted with his own hands. Every gust of wind that bent the stalks felt to him like a choir, every rustle of leaves a hymn confirming that the silence below still obeyed. The community did not look closer because war itself had turned death into background noise. Boys who had once laughed in schoolyards now returned only as names and letters pinned to church doors. Families draped black cloths over windows as often as they changed linens. In this chorus of grief, Elias's composure was admired. He did not collapse or drink himself senseless. He did not retreat from the company. He smiled, greeted neighbors, offered bread, and attended every vigil. To the town, he seemed the image of steady faith. To Elias, it was nothing more than a mask perfected through years of practice, the careful calm of a man who could arrange horror beneath his barn and then speak scripture above it without trembling. But not all neighbors were blind. Samuel Mercer, who lived a half-mile east, worked his fields late and walked home after sundown. He began to notice strange odors drifting across the wind. Sweet oil thickened with something foul, and beneath it a sharper scent that prickled the throat. On nights when the sky was clear and the air still, he swore he smelled charred hair riding the breeze, faint at first, then stronger until his stomach knotted. He told himself it must be animals, some careless burning of hides or waste, but the smell came too often, always from the direction of the Abbott barn, always on nights when no smoke was seen. Samuel mentioned it once to his wife, who shushed him quickly, warning that grief can make men imagine things. She reminded him that Elias had already suffered enough. No one wanted suspicion thrown upon a man so admired. Samuel nodded, but doubt lingered like the odor itself, stubborn and sour. He watched Elias in church, searching for cracks in the man's composure, but found none. Elias clasped hands, sang hymns, bowed in prayer, his movements slow and exact as ever. Samuel almost convinced himself he had imagined it, until one night he saw a faint orange glow behind the barn slats, as though a lantern burned longer than needed, as though someone worked below while the rest of the farm slept. Elias never faltered under scrutiny. He welcomed visitors into his home, offered cider, spoke warmly of the crops, even allowed children to play near his porch. He spoke of his sons as if they were alive somewhere on distant battlefields, their absence explained by duty, their silence explained by distance. No one pressed further. War had made people numb to detail, eager to accept neat explanations rather than confront disquieting mysteries. To accuse Elias would have been to accuse their own faith in the order of things, and so no one did. Beneath this cover of innocence, Elias refined his rituals further. He recorded not only the methods he used, but the reactions of his neighbors. He noted how grief blinded them, how faith softened suspicion, how loss made lies believable. He treated the community itself as another experiment, testing how much horror could be hidden in plain sight if clothed in godliness. Their trust became another ledger entry, another measure of silence achieved. And still Samuel Mercer lingered in unease. On still nights he found himself awake, listening for the faint echo of iron striking iron, or for the distant muffled thud that sounded too deliberate to be wind. He considered telling the minister, but fear held him back. Fear not only of being wrong, but of being right. Fear that behind Elias's calm smile there was something the town would never want to see. So he kept quiet, like all the others, letting suspicion rot inside him while Elias continued his work undisturbed. The Abbott farm thus remained untouched, its fields green, its barns standing proud against the horizon, its patriarch bowed in prayer before neighbors who never questioned, who never saw the fragments buried underfoot. War explained all absences, and Elias Abbott used that truth like armor, a shield stronger than steel. And yet on certain nights when smoke curled unseen and the wind carried faint sweetness turned rancid, one man knew the scent of something not explained by war at all. It was the smell of work done in silence, the smell of order shaped by fire, the faint proof that the Abbott farm held secrets far more terrifying than any battlefield could reveal. The storm came without warning, a hard wall of wind that peeled the Abbott barn roof like a lid, flinging shingles across wet fields and exposing rafters already blackened where no good fire had any right to burn. Rain slashed inward and hissed on heat's scar, the loosened timbers beating a dull alarm, and lanterns appeared along the lane as neighbors hurried through mud with collars up and eyes fixed on the broken crown of the building. Samuel Mercer reached the gate first and caught the smell he had feared to name. Sweet oil undercut by charred hair, a message carried in wet air that said, "Look down, look under. Look where sound is swallowed." A heap of tools in the rear corner had shifted, revealing a squared seam of iron that did not belong to honest floorboards. And when Samuel hooked a bar beneath it, the trapdoor rose with a wet sigh and showed a ladder sinking into the dark. Elias stood beside them, already dressed, hat pulled low, face calm as if greeting guests after a rude knock. And he called it a useless old cellar he had meant to fill, but Samuel put a boot to the rung and descended anyway. The air thickened as he went down, wax and iron heavy on the tongue, and the lantern sweat traced channels cut in the wood where water ran like quiet veins, all of it too deliberate to be rotted. His feet found a floor that flexed slightly, as if the earth itself had learned to accept confession, and the light circled a ring of iron hooks polished by use, each set at even distance, each bearing a small scar where weight had once insisted. Chains swung lightly from beams, their rust dark in places where rain could not explain the color, and the boards below them wore ovals of stain, oil hardened to dull lips that promised practice rather than accident. A widened harness frame waited under a sheen of tallow, straps laid open like patient hands, and nearby a trough of packed, damp soil held a smooth surface like a held breath. Not storm mud, but work arranged to keep shape. In the far corner, a low drift of grain sagged around a depression the length of a body, edges feathered by countless small shifts that sealed the middle like a mouth refusing to open. Others came down, and their lanterns turned the ceiling into a trembling sky, every small light sketching a map of harm. And the minister stood among them with his mouth opening and closing, while a woman hid her eyes behind her apron and did not climb away. Elias descended last, the crowd parting by habit, and he went to a ledger on the table and set his palm upon it like a blessing, then opened it with the care of a father and showed lines and numbers as though unveiling a craft. He spoke the boys' names without hurry, each followed by a measure, each measure followed by a word he used for perfection. And the chamber received his voice like an old friend. For a long breath no one moved because the mind clung to its order, but the shattered roof still thrashed and water tracked down the cut channels, and in that dripping truth the town finally understood what war had helped them ignore. The hooks were not for beasts, the mud not for storage, the grain not for hunger, the chains not for tools. This was a church built to quiet living sound, and the congregation had slept above it all along. They whispered that the boys had not marched to any camp, they had been kept. They had been kept and arranged, and the words fell like stones into a well without bottom. Elias did not run, did not deny. He only closed the book and offered his wrists, calm as a craftsman whose long labor had reached completion and now sought a place on a shelf where others could see. When they bound him with a chain taken from the beam, he did not flinch. And when they guided him up the ladder, the room seemed to exhale. Lantern flames stretching thin and settling back as if the place itself had been waiting for that small surrender. Outside, the rain had evened into a steady fall, and the barn gaped at the sky like a wound, and the neighbors formed a mute ring, faces lit from below in a way that made them look suddenly older, as if the night had stolen years from each without asking. The fields hissed, the silo ticked, the wind moved east, but the farm no longer belonged to weather. It belonged to record, and record does not forget. Before dawn, they carried out what could be lifted and covered, boards and jars and the box that was not a coffin until he made it one, and the sheriff's wagon groaned under the new weight of proof. The minister would say later that the war still took thousands by sunup, as it did each day. But on that night a different army was found. An army of methods, an army of rooms, an army of quiet. What the nation lost to distant fields, Elias Abbott had claimed in his own house, not for country, but for obsession. And the neighbors felt their knees weaken under the simple fact that evil does not require distance to grow. As they drove him toward the courthouse, he wore a fixed smile, the calm of a man who believes the world at last understands his language, and rain beaded on the chain like counting beads. Morning waited like a blade along the horizon, and the town followed in a broken line, drenched and silent, stepping out of the darkness of not knowing into the harder darkness of knowing, and the road ahead bent toward judgment. They brought Elias Abbott to the courthouse under heavy rain, but he did not lower his head or flinch against the chain biting his wrists. He walked with the steady pace of a man who believed himself chosen, as though the march was not an arrest, but a procession toward recognition. In the crowded chamber he was seated before neighbors who once prayed beside him, men and women who now stared at him with a horror they could not speak aloud. Yet Elias did not tremble. He folded his hands in his lap as though ready for prayer, and when the questions began, his voice carried the calm cadence of Scripture. He did not deny what the storm had revealed. He did not contest the chamber below, the hooks, the troughs, the wax, the chains. He admitted it with a serenity that unnerved even the sheriff, speaking not as a criminal caught, but as a teacher unveiling his craft. He said his sons had not been stolen by war, but preserved from it, protected from chaos by his hands. He claimed they had volunteered in the highest sense, not with words, but with their silence, with their obedience to the order he had given them. He called them offerings not to death, but to permanence, bodies sealed against the decay of time, spirits measured and bound closer to God than any soldier could hope to be. The court expected rage or madness, the outbursts of a lunatic driven by grief. But Elias's voice never rose. He explained his methods as though giving instructions on planting seed or curing hides. He described the way breath could be caught in glass, how silence could be measured in minutes, how flesh could be sealed with wax so it would not wither. He spoke of each son in turn, not with sorrow but with pride, recalling their strength, their endurance, the exact numbers that marked their crossing into stillness. He spoke of them as if they had become more than men, as if he had lifted them out of human frailty and fixed them in eternity. His words chilled the listeners more than any scream could, because they revealed a man who believed evil was not rebellion, but order perfected. Neighbors wept quietly in the gallery, not only for the 6 sons, but for the betrayal that cut through every sermon, every prayer Elias had ever led. They had trusted his calmness as proof of faith, and now they saw it for what it was, the mask of a mind that had practiced stillness until it could hide anything. The minister lowered his gaze, ashamed not of Elias but of himself, for never once had he questioned the man who prayed more cleanly, who spoke more evenly, who seemed more certain than all others. The sheriff clenched his jaw, not to contain anger but to contain dread, for there was no rage to fight here, no madness to bind. There was only calm conviction, the kind that grows roots in silence and spreads unnoticed until it consumes. When the prosecutor asked Elias if he regretted his acts, he tilted his head slightly as though the question itself was foolish. He said he had done no murder, only preservation. He said his sons had been spared the mud of battlefields, the filth of hospitals, the anonymous graves where thousands would rot without marker. He said he had given them order when the world gave only chaos. He claimed he had lifted them above the reach of war. He insisted that if others could not see the perfection in it, that blindness belonged not to him but to them. His words landed in the chamber like stones dropped in a well, leaving a silence deeper with each echo. The jury sat pale, their hands trembling as they wrote notes they barely understood. They were farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, men and women of plain lives, unprepared to weigh not only the crime but the mind that delivered it with such calm precision. To call Elias insane felt too simple, for he did not babble or thrash. To call him evil felt too small, for his voice made evil sound like order, like patience, like devotion carried too far. He unsettled them because he was not wild but methodical, not frantic but composed. His presence forced them to see that monstrosity can wear the face of faith, can sit among neighbors, and can bow its head in prayer without tremor. When the verdict was read, Elias nodded once, as if receiving news long expected. The sentence was death, but he seemed almost relieved, as though the final silence he had sought for others would now embrace him. He asked for no last meal, no prayer, no farewell. He only asked that his ledger be preserved, claiming it contained not sin but proof. His request was denied, but his calm never broke, even as chains were tightened, even as the crowd gathered to see judgment done. Elias carried the same stillness he had cultivated all his life, a stillness that unsettled more than violence ever could. And when he was led away from the courthouse, neighbors who once envied his composure now feared it most, for they understood that Elias Abbott had never hidden his nature at all. He had only wrapped it in order, in godliness, in the silence they mistook for virtue. Now, stripped bare, he revealed the truth, that evil does not always rage in fire or madness. Sometimes it waits in quiet rooms, shaping rituals with steady hands, believing all the while that it serves not destruction but perfection. After the trial ended and the sentence was carried out, the town moved quickly to erase the stain of the Abbott name. The farmhouse was burned, its ashes scattered to the wind, and the land was parceled off in quiet sales. Neighbors avoided speaking of it, not out of respect but out of fear that words themselves might keep the memory alive. What Elias had built below his barn, the rituals he carried out in silence, became a wound the town wanted to cover with new soil and new crops. But history does not bury so easily. It waits, whispering beneath the surface, forcing itself into record whether people will do it or not. Local leaders petitioned the state to tighten enlistment laws, demanding better records of names and numbers so that no family could ever again claim their sons had gone to war when they had not. Clerks began keeping double copies. Ministers were instructed to report any unusual disappearances, and community watch was quietly encouraged under the cover of patriotism. These measures were not presented as lessons learned from Elias Abbott. They were framed as practical reforms during wartime. Yet everyone in the county knew whose shadow had pushed them into existence. The silence of one father had forced a system to listen harder. Still, the matter of his ledger remained. The sheriff wanted it destroyed, but others argued it was evidence, something too dangerous to release yet too valuable to burn. It was eventually sealed in the archives of Lansing, locked in a cabinet with the label "restricted," a word that both protected the public and admitted a deeper truth. Some knowledge cannot be erased, only hidden. There were whispers that doctors read it in secret, hoping to understand how the mind bends faith into cruelty. And there were darker rumors that parts of it were copied before the pages were sealed, that somewhere men obsessed with preservation and order carried on the study Elias had begun. The town never built a memorial for the 6 Abbott sons. Their names were not carved on the war monument, for they had never marched, never enlisted, never belonged to the nation's cause. They belonged only to their father's silence, and the shame of that truth was heavier than grief. Their absence was marked only by unspoken pauses at gatherings, by glances at the place where their house once stood, by the unease that lingered each time the wind shifted and carried the memory of oil and charred hair back into thought. They were remembered not as boys who might have become men, but as echoes of a horror too intimate to honor. In time, new families tilled the fields, planted corn where the chamber had once breathed silence, and children played in the orchards without knowing what roots fed the trees. But the older generation never forgot. They understood that Elias had not simply ended lives. He had changed the way a community trusted itself. He had shown that evil does not always announce itself with violence, but can grow in the spaces where questions go unasked, where silence is mistaken for strength, and where faith blinds rather than protects. That was his true legacy, a silence that outlived him, shaping not only laws but the hearts of those who had once believed they knew their neighbor. When Elias Abbott was gone, the town tried to fold the memory of him into silence, the same way they had once accepted his composure without question. The barn was torn down, the cellar filled, the house left to rot. But his presence did not fade, for what unsettled most was not the devices he built or the sons he destroyed. It was the knowledge that such horror had grown unnoticed inside the frame of ordinary life. Elias had not been a creature of legend or a stranger from shadow. He had been a farmer who sold seed, a father who bowed in prayer, a neighbor who offered a steady hand at funerals. His evil was not hidden in rage but in patience, not in madness but in method, and that is why it unsettled more than war itself. The nation at large buried his story beneath greater grief, for battlefields claimed thousands more than one family ever could. Yet for those who had lived beside him, the question gnawed. How could so many eyes have watched him, so many ears have heard him, and yet no one saw the truth until storm and chance split the roof apart? His mask had worked because it was not false in the usual sense. He believed his faith, he believed his rituals, and he believed his sons were preserved beyond decay. That conviction made him steady, and steadiness is what people trust most, even when it leads them blind into silence. In the years that followed, laws were written to track enlistments more carefully. Sermons reminded people that faith is no shield against evil, and parents watched their neighbors with sharper suspicion. But the deeper fear remained unspoken, that no law or sermon can truly expose the mind of a man who hides in stillness. Evil like Elias's does not roar, it waits. It waits in the pauses between questions, in the hush of a congregation, in the moment before dawn when a house seems at peace. It waits where silence is mistaken for goodness, and so the story lingers heavy as soil pressed over graves. Elias Abbott was not a monster of fire but of order, not a stranger but a man trusted too deeply. His name forces a question that cannot be buried with him. What do you think? Could it happen again? Could such horror live unnoticed behind the walls of an ordinary home, while neighbors pass by and mistake silence for faith?